Good evening. My name is Sam Bibby, and I'm very pleased indeed to welcome you here tonight to the second of our in-person events as part of the Association for Art History's 2022 festival. Our week-long programme of events runs until next Monday and is a celebration of art, design and architecture taking place at museums, galleries and cultural organisations nationwide. It's my great pleasure to introduce Sunil Gupta. Sunil Gupta is a British-Canadian citizen who lives in London and who has for many years been involved with independent photography as a critical practice, focusing on race, migration and queer issues. A retrospective of his work was shown at the Photographers Gallery in London in 2020 to 2021, before moving to the Image Centre in Toronto. He's also a professorial fellow at UCA Farnham. His forthcoming book, We Were Here, Sexuality, Photography and Cultural Difference, selected writings by Sunil Gupta, will be published later this month by Aperture New York. Current exhibitions include Sunil Gupta, Songs of Deliverance, Part 1 and Part 2 at Hammersmith Hospital, and his work is in many private and public collections, including the Tokyo Museum of Photography, Philadelphia Museum of Art, Royal Ontario Museum, Tate, and the Museum of Modern Art, New York. This evening, Sunil will be in conversation with Fiona Anderson. Fiona is Senior Lecturer in Art History in the Fine Art Department at Newcastle University. Her queer art historical work focuses on practices of gentrification, preservation, archiving, and histories of HIV/AIDS in the USA and the UK. She is author of Cruising the Dead River, David Wojnarowicz and New York's Ruined Waterfront, which was published by the University of Chicago in 2019. Sunil and Fiona will talk for 40 to 45 minutes or so before opening things up to the audience for questions, which will then be followed by a chance for a more informal conversation here in the gallery over a drink. Please join me in welcoming Sunil and Fiona.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you, Alan, for inviting and the Association for Art History for inviting us, and thanks to all of you for coming as well. This is, Sunil and I were just saying, this is the third in conversation that we've done. It's the first one in person, so we have a lot to say to each other. And for this conversation, given that this Sunil's collection of edited collection of writings, which spans from the 1970s through to the present, we thought we would use that as a framing device, really, for the conversation, as a way into thinking about your work and your life as a photographer, as a writer, and as a curator. In the foreword to the book, Theo Gordon describes you as a prolific, insightful, and witty writer. And all three of those things are true. So you start writing, the book begins in the 1980s, so I wonder if you could say a bit about your turn to writing in the 1980s, what brought that about and what you were writing about and why.
Okay, so, well, I have a very colonial background. So I'm Indian, but very Anglo-Indian in that sense, so very text-based. So I grew up with text and with literature and with reading and writing primarily, and visual art and photography was an accident. And so I think if it hadn't happened, I might have had a more serious attempt at the writing side. But actually the book begins with essentially my MA thesis at the Royal College of Art, which was an impassioned plea about how the conspiracy that I saw within British Fleet Street media, mainstream media, to depict in pictures the non-Western world as being completely incapable of managing itself and pretty much dying of civil wars, famines, floods, disasters, man-made or natural, and most of the pictures depicted people either dead or about to die any minute, and desperately in need of being saved by London and New York, presumably. That was sort of the messaging. So I wrote about this, and my professor said, he just wrote on it that it was too personal. So that was, but I managed to get it out and published, so that gave me encouragement. There was a book published, there were 2 books published called Photography, Politics 1 and 2, were edited by Simon Watney, Joe Spence, Patricia Holland, and then I think a different person joined in. So they were very, very good. They published it, so I was very excited. My professor was Christopher Frayling at the Royal College of Art. So I said, well, sod him, I'm just going to go out and do something else. He just doesn't get it. So, so that's kind of how I wrote, I think partly because I hadn't read anything like this, because everything I read at the Royal College of Art was so Euro-modern art historical photography history, you know, very classic, and nobody talking back to it in any way. And so we had also then a live series of people as part of our art history teaching. We could have almost anybody we wanted, being as it was the RCA. So we had the Don McCullens and all the people who made these war pictures come by, and and so on, and talking about their experiences in Vietnam, in Biafra, and wherever, India's partition, all that kind of stuff. But you couldn't really challenge it because they were already kind of on the way to being, what's the word, kind of becoming
Canonized.
Canonized, that's right. I was going to say kind of monumentalized. But
that
yeah.
works too.
And so, so it came from that, a need to put something out that I hadn't seen put out before.
So that was where this impulse to write from a place that was personal came from as well.
Yeah.
That this combination of experience of listening to these people talking about their work and their kind of this othering gaze on different parts of the world, but also the spectacle of British mainstream media as well.
Yeah, because what happened also in that period I was at the RCA, which was just 2 years actually, I made my initial trip back to India, where I'd come from, bearing in mind that I left as a teenager and hadn't been back. And so the plane rides are quite telling, you know, because they're the thing in between. So you take off from Heathrow and you arrive in Delhi and you walk out and you see this completely other thing happening. And you think, this has got to be connected. Why is it like this here, like this over there? People were acting as if it's not connected. There's some ancient history. But I was looking for this connection of this. So I was quite very motivated by this. It just happened to me now. You know, I just came back last week from India. It's taken me 6 days to kind of get my head into like, I'm here. And you know, so everybody's white suddenly. Everybody was brown for the last 5 weeks. Looking back this way, and sort of contemporary, if I make it contemporary version. So from India, you're looking at Ukraine, you're thinking, those white people having a war, why are they getting so, why do they think it's the most important thing that ever happened? You know, there's bigger problems around. There's a huge flood in Pakistan, lots more people are involved. Also from our perspective, the Soviet Union has always been friendlier. And so, compared to Britain and America, you know, so like the whole geopolitics is different. So everyone doesn't just naturally go like, oh, I'm anti-war and I hate the Russians. And I want to just stop Tolstoy and ballet and everything. Which is what's happening, you know, like
this is taking a turn quite quickly. It's fascinating. So this is, the trip that you make back to India when you're at the RCA is in the early 1980s.
Yeah,
and
80 and then, yeah.
Yeah, that wasn't long after you'd moved to London from New York.
That's right.
And so this is around the time that writing starts to feature in your practice as a photographer, as an artist?
As well, because actually I came to text through doing tape slide also.
It would be really interesting to hear a bit about that tape slide work.
Which is not in, actually, yeah, so we can go out of the book then. It's,
That's allowed, yeah.
So then in 1980, the other thing I did was to try and educate myself about being a young gay man in London, having come from New York and not really knowing my way around. And I decided to do it through photography. Camera is a very useful tool to give you an into things. So I decided to make a project about London Gay Switchboard, which used to be and maybe still is the largest LGBT NGO, size-wise. And so I made this thing called a tape slide, which is basically a poor man's video. So you have multiple slide projections and then soundtrack. And my soundtrack was principally interviewing the volunteers and trying to discern why they were doing it, but also what it was about London, where things were happening. Many of them had come to London from elsewhere, a bit like New York. London became this magnet for queer people to gravitate to. And so there was a bit of that also. So I learned a little bit about people have left Yorkshire, people have left Surrey, people have left forever to be able to live this way, you know, in central London. So this tape slide was my first, I guess, encounter with the script. So in a way, everything got transcribed, as you can imagine, and then had to be edited. So I had this first kind of large scale, I was going to say, because there were so many people involved. I spoke into way too many, because my problem is a bit overkill. So I just go out and interview way too many people, have too many tapes, and then they have to be transcribed and edited and somehow put together. And then I was trying to be very arty as well. So I was trying to make it not like a documentary. So
where did that resistance come from to the...
From my art school.
Making a documentary.
Yeah, because there was a resistance to documentary was starting out. And also I'd grown up with film history, you know, because there was no real photo history at the time. But so you could either have print history, which is what the college wanted you to do. When I first got there, they put us in the history of print, and we began with Dürer, you know, in the 16th century. And I thought we would never get to the 20th century in 2 years. So they said, okay, we're going to move you to film. At least film started more recently. And so, yeah, so we had all that. So we had this great teacher whose name, I have terrible memory. So we never saw a whole film. We saw short scenes that we saw frame by frame. So it was all like in bits. So that bitty nature of it was what was very attractive. And of course, I sat through all the French New Wave and the German stuff and the Japanese and everything. So everything was, so my plan was for it to be not like television documentary anyway. So I did it. So I did it that way. And I threw in some visuals from the art world, meaning I inserted Robert Mapplethorpe's big black penises into the pictures and whatnot. And then I showed it to London Gay Switchboard, thinking it was a fantastic piece of work. And so 50 people came to see it. And half of them really hated what I'd done. You know, I think they were expecting normal, standard documentary saying, wonderful organization, wonderful volunteers, aren't they doing a great job? And instead, I'd mixed it up with this other stuff. And Lisa Power, famous lesbian, got up and just pulled the plug on the AV. That was the end of it.
What did you do?
I think I had a man speaking when her picture appeared.
Right.
She was really upset about that. She wanted the things to match. So, and I was trying not to match.
Well, it's interesting because you're making that work, and this is a period of intense, you described it to me the other day as a time of intense identity politics, in which what might be meant by terms and identities like lesbian, gay, but also thinking about a time of really critical reflection on political blackness and solidarity and coalition politics. So it's interesting that your response to that is this arty engagement with documentary, with text and image. I mean, how did that context, that climate, shape your way of working with images and with text?
Well, I think it was partly made possible through this distillation from my previous experience of 3 years in what was to become an undergraduate degree at Farnham, where the class was very big and none of this happened, this kind of level of debate. It was much more basic, into this more kind of rarefied atmosphere. You know, like there was this atmosphere then, because there were very few people then, my class was only 6 people. Now it's 60 at the RCA. So then the atmosphere was, we are the chosen people, you know, who want to carry the flame of David Hockney, etc. So it was very intense and you were quite close to things. And you know, you began to notice that all the queer people from Farnham got into the RCA, not the straights for some reason. It was pure coincidence, but we were all there in South Kensington together, saying, wow, I made it, so did you. And then somebody called Eddie Chambers started Black Arts in Wolverhampton. And I don't know how I heard of it, but somehow we heard of it. And by '83, when we graduated, I'd met the other black students in the college across the departments, because it was very departmentalized. You can picture British art schools, you know, by the art medium. But whether it were in sculpture or in glass or in whatever, we kind of got together. And we got a room from the college. And in '83, we had a black student show in this one room, as well during the degree shows. And then we made a big fatal kind of decision to invite the GLC to our little black show. And they were so excited to meet us because we were like very articulate, babbling away, you know.
Do you want to explain for, not everyone might know what the GLC stands for or what they dismantled as they are.
It was the town hall, used to be called the Greater London Council, and used to have something called the Ethnic Minorities Unit. And so we'd invited them, and they were very happy to meet us, and we were happy to meet them, and then some of us got very involved with them, you know, in the town hall. And my whole attention, a lot of us, our whole attention just turned away from what the RCA had trained us for, which was for a commercial career in Bond Street or wherever, to across the river into a more rights-oriented, Labour Party-oriented kind of, you know, let's work for London's diverse minority populations as a whole across all the different kinds. So the GLC specialized in all kinds of events for pensioners, for lesbian mothers, for black people, for Asians, and then any number of combinations, and how to service this, and also to keep them interested by using culture. So literally, cultural politics became, with the like big capital letters, cultural politics, going to meetings, sitting in a room with Ken Livingstone, looking at advertising, trying to point out. I ended up with something called anti-racist committee, which was very complicated. It was easier to spot racism than anti-racism. It was a little more kind of ephemeral. Anyway, it was like that. So yeah, so a little taste of that. Also gave you a feeling of empowerment, whereas otherwise you'd always felt like you were this lone voice against this huge monolithic European art history, which was like completely white and stopped in Greece. Nobody ever mentioned India to me in 5 years of teaching. No one mentioned homosexuality to me. I had to invent it all.
And how did that experience of that collective black organizing with other students at the RCA and then being part of these groups within the GLC and the funding that that provided, as well as this collective way of thinking and living, how did that shape the work that you were making?
Well, it immediately took me away from paying any attention to the market, worrying about trying to sell edition prints and all that nonsense. So we just made the picture that we wanted to make, which were usually around issues that mattered to us. You know, in my case, it was about being gay, it was about being Indian, it was about being black, it was about breaking up with my boyfriend just when I got my visa. You know, my whole life sort of suddenly went off belly up. It's done that a few times, actually. So I went from living in this huge house in Fulham with this Swiss banker to living in some kind of squat place with a bunch of white lesbians in Holloway who had no heating or anything and no money, and they just put me in the window to scare off burglars, I think. So, it was very cold, that's what I remember. So, and then a nice friend who was sitting over there actually took me into their house in Finsbury Park, which at least had central heating and lots of comforts. So that was quite nice. So yeah, so why did I say that anyway? But it was, you were saying, so that's what you made the work about. So basically I made work about things that happened to me. So that they were the trigger. Again. You know, I didn't go out to find something to make work about. I didn't read an academic text and think, there's a really interesting theory, I'm going to visualize something. So sometimes in the art world, I feel a bit of a fraud. I sit and listen to these talks. I don't know what they're talking about. And that's certainly not why I made my work. I made my work because somebody left me after 10 years. It was terrible. I mean, aside from the financial thing, I was devastated. I was suddenly all by myself in, you know, big London, thinking, what do I do now? I have to go to heaven and all this and try to find somebody new. It's not going to happen. So I was I'd come here with somebody. I hadn't had this problem, like you have to find somebody in the metropolis. And so that kind of thing. So I made work about it. It was 10 years on.
Which is popping past at different points.
That's how I made the work, kind of. And sometimes there would be something coming out. I went to a lot of meetings through the GLC, through black arts, through being gay. There was a little gay black group happened at the back of Gays the Word bookshop on Marchman Street, not far from here. I went to that. We splintered off into an Asian group, which became Shakti, which then became the monthly disco that Ritu runs. And then I thought, I've already done this before in the 70s, and I don't think I want to do it again, so I kind of let them get on with it. And there were all kinds of meetings to go to. Then before you knew it, there was AIDS meetings to go to, and then there was Clause 28, there were those meetings to go to and organize some kind of response. Within the GLC itself, there was a bunch of media people, and some of us who were involved in photography got together and tried to launch a tabloid. Maybe someone remembers this. It was called News on Sunday. It had one edition. So we recognized that the British tabloids, they're the worst, but they also have a huge base. And that's why the Tories keep getting in, because they have this tabloid mouthpiece, like constantly feeding the masses. So there should be a left-wing equivalent tabloid, like a Lefty Sun type thing. But it didn't really happen because, of course, being lefty, it had way too many words and too many columns and too many opinions all on one page instead of just one picture and one large letter or something. So you spent your time kind of doing that, and you didn't make much money. And then you wrote things, I began to write things. So my photography interest led me to the funded photography spaces that we used to have, which was Camera Work, Blackfriars, and what's now become Photo Fusion. Camera Work had a magazine, and Camera Work also initiated projects. So I was involved in kind of as some advisory capacity, so I'd help in deciding who got the money, and then sometimes I'd help by writing the introductory essay for the person who got the money to make the book. So that kind of thing. And so that's, and then, there were our two magazines. There was 10/8 in Birmingham, which used to commission bits of writing. That was a great magazine. It was on the similar wavelength, metropolitan, issue-based And there was Creative Camera, which was more portfolio and crafty, but you could write reviews. And then there was, of course, Gloria up in Edinburgh, who had Portfolio magazine. This is, so there was some British publications like that you could write for, and also show in, possibly. And so that's where the writing was slowly happening in the background. And then I encountered policy, which was terrible. Then I sort of, was that night, I was like, got involved with writing policy for what used to be Greater London Arts, the Arts Council tied. And the Arts Council itself, we got co-opted. I spent a long time, several years, reading and writing policy. So right up to the days of lottery funds. I don't want, you know, so all paperwork, gigantic kind of paperwork, writing.
And around this late 1980s period where you're going to all of these meetings and writing for these magazines as well, this is the point that stage documentary becomes a very big component of your photographic practice as well. Maybe you could say a bit about a series like Exiles and about that, the experience of of making that and how this relates to some of these histories that you've been talking us through.
So I came to photography and I came to England thinking I wanted to be Eugene Smith, because my head was in the 50s, and then by the time I left school, it wasn't possible because the commercial setup had all moved on. Documentary had all gone to television, and stills photography, all you could do work-wise, because I worked for Fleet Street also, that's why I paid my rent there, was to basically try and make portraits of this week's celebrities who were passing through, you know, either promoting a book or something. So that's, and then there was had been this big critique of documentary practice as a practice. And I'd had this experience of going to India and coming back with pictures and trying to use documentary as a methodology. And then, of course, it was having it wasn't working very well. I had all kinds of ethical issues, especially in this area. So I particularly wanted to document gay men in India. I thought, that's what I'm going to do. There's no gay men from India in MoMA. I'm going to put them there. I'm going to start now. And so I started with documentary. And of course, gay men in India, poor things, they don't have any gay bars or any gay liberation or anything. So all they have is a lot of parks where they hang out and have sex in. So I'd hide in a bush and I'd wait for a couple of them to turn up and find each other. And just when it was happening, I would jump out from the bush, take a quick snap.
It's worth saying that look, these people's faces aren't in the photos.
No, they're not in these photos. And yeah, so you know, it was flash and they looked a bit startled. And I thought, I really can't start publishing this.
Yeah.
So, although Mary Ellen Mark went to Bombay and took pictures of prostitutes having sex and published them quite happily. Anyway, so I thought this is not what I want to do. And so it seemed natural to move into this sort of scripted area, like London Gay Switchboard. And I had my kind of amateur interest in film, and so I thought, I kind of went into this idea of casting it. So my main requirement was that the guys had to be gay, and they had to be Indian, and we were in India. And so the camera would dutifully record that. But the rest of it we could create by casting and scripting. And so I researched the situation more thoroughly with the tape recorder again, you know, so collected my info and then gathered my cast, and then who were also my informants, and then we would go to cruising sites and reenact what they were doing specifically for the camera, which is why many of them then turned away. They didn't particularly want to be seen. bearing in mind that this is the mid-80s, so of course they said never can be seen in India, just show it over there, you know, so like it would never cross over.
It was a commission from the Photographers Gallery in London.
The project itself was a commission, for a show called Body Politics in '87. So it was going to be seen, but then, so aside from this, also my subjects in India didn't know what a photography exhibition was, and why would anybody, put a photograph in a frame in public and then make a whole show out of it. There was no photography in the Indian art market till now, till 2007. So the whole idea, people didn't really understand why I was doing it. I couldn't, so with my best intentions, and I would shoot, come back to London, process the film, make contact sheets, go back, show contact sheets, and say, this is all the process, this is what's going to happen. There's this gallery, and it's going to show them. But they had nothing to relate it to in their own lives.
How did you try and articulate that in those conversations? If people are saying, why would you? Yeah. Why are you making a work about this? Or
I just couldn't. They couldn't get it. That they could understand magazine, but not gallery, because they'd never seen one. So we showed it in '87 in the Photographers Gallery with the text underneath the pictures, and it was analog days, so you made C prints and then had to typeset the text separately and all that business. So, and it kind of sank without a trace. It was a big show about body politics, and I think people just, although I did have a picture of one white person in it, I knew this would I'd have this. I had this earlier with another Indian project where if you show it in London, all the English people just walk by and think, oh, that's something ethnic. And then they're either interested in it or they're not, but they don't stop and like really think about it. There's something like that happened. It was a kind of, I think in London at the time, it was, the body politics were really like feminist. So it was about Joe Spence and people like that, and Helen Chadwick. They weren't worried, they weren't Indian gays, like, why? Where did that come from? You know? Something like that happened. I felt very like a bit despondent that it sank like a stone. It generated no interest whatsoever.
And you return.
But it gave me a method, so then I came back to it for the pretended families thing.
For pretended family relationships, where you are responding to Clause 28.
Clause 28. Yeah. So that was initially that was the couple's portraits taken a step further. So they were suddenly they were in color, and then the couples were multiracial. Because by then, by '86, the other thing that happened was that parallel thing. I had these two things happening. There was the gay thing, then there was the black thing. I got blacker and blacker. So by mid '80s, I only speak to black people and gay people. So I had hardly anybody to speak to. Well, luckily I lived in Brixton. There was a bunch of them over there, but I never left there. And I lived in this bubble. And I know there were private parties for gay men of color, basically. So because when you go out on the scene, it was also white, you know, and people would say strange things to you when you pick them up. They say, why do your people have that funny, smelly food, you know, that kind of thing. So anyway, so I started making these multiracial gay couples because I was in one. So I was living happily with this lovely white guy, different one, British one, proper working class, grammar school, been to Oxford a few times, PhD from Columbia, etc., all into writing. Never looked at the pictures, so we used to get the Sunday papers. He'd read all the text. I just look at the pictures and wonder why my picture wasn't on the paper, and see who took the picture and turned the page. So we were quite well suited that way. And so, and then this clause thing started to happen. And then, then he went to do the PhD at Columbia when this was all happening. And the next thing I know, he's sending me little haikus about us, saying, I call you my love, but you're not my love, kind of haikus. So I'll put them next to the pictures. I thought, what am I going to do with this? It's very shocking. I just put it out there. And then when the clause thing happened, I went to some demos. And so then you have this other problem in the British left in photography. What do you do with demonstrations? And there were hundreds of them against Thatcher that you went to. And so if you document them, how to document them? If you document them from the outside, it's the vantage point of the police. It's the vantage point of the tabloid media. If you try and document them from within, and then you just get the backs of everybody, or just one or two people. And so, anyway, so it was kind of a complicated, insoluble issue that we'd all discussed quite a lot, how to deal with this huge mass of documentary pictures everybody was taking of demonstrations against this. There were loads of them. There was CND, there was all of that, and the miners. I have some of those as well, you know. But again, taking like a media thing. I don't know how to make it subjective, you know, be inside with it as well. So I decided one way would be to cut it up. So I grew up very much with modernist photography in the background in New York. So negative was sacred. You made a print of the entire negative from edge to edge. And so this was my big radical act, was to cut it and just have a slither of the negative hanging on to the end. And then I made sort of collages, which sort of took me away from straight photography, which I wasn't very happy with at first, but I didn't know what else to do with it. It began to look too much like art and not like photography, because we had this art versus photography thing. There were many key debates, art versus photography, straight feminist versus pornography. That was the big thing, censorship. So there were many meetings to go to kind of educate yourself about these things. And so I thought, I'm getting more bourgeois, I'm making like art. Suddenly it's like a unique thing, and it's not reproducible. Because I made each one by hand with a scalpel and all this. It was all too arty-farty, and I made it, and I had to borrow someone's studio, Eve Lomax's actually, to make them in. And so, yeah, so that's where that text came from.
I'm conscious that we've been speaking for 30 minutes and we're only in the late 1980s. Oh, no, it's fascinating. One of the bits of text that I think is really interesting, that it's all interesting, but the columns that you were writing for the newspaper columns for the Mail Today when you were living in Delhi in the mid-noughties, the early sort of 2000s.
2005 to
12,
yeah.
I would love to hear more about the work that you were making at that point, because it resonates with a lot of what you've been talking about thus far. And when we were talking the other day, you spoke about a shift in your practice from what you called identity politics to reflecting on and making work about both photography and writing about India-specific challenges as someone in the majority there, and that there was a different kind of urgency to sort of the experiences of queer people in India at that time.
Yeah, I began to feel in the 90s, when things were then on the wane, Black Arts was on the wane, that I sort of had no space left in this country, and that all of the work that we'd done was what the Arts Council used to call its policy, was the glory of the garden being England. And I felt whatever I did, however critical you are, however black you are, it's still all about the glory of England. You know, you can be Isaac Julian, but it's the glory of England. You come under the UK. And so I began to feel that in India, I didn't have that. And that here was a place that really needed sorting out. And being Indian, it was really my job to help sort it out, rather than sit in London, have a cushy life, and just visit them from afar and use them as research subject matter. I needed to stay put and do something there, and it needed both photography and homosexuality needed to like good kick up their asses, because it was all stuck in a terrible place. There was no photography being shown. Being gay was illegal entirely still. So, you know, a lot of work needed to be done, and I felt I'd had the experience here. So I kind of offered myself to them.
How were you received?
And it was quite well received. I was adopted by a young queer activist group. India missed LGBT altogether, like they missed laptops. They went straight to mobile phones and queer all in one go. So suddenly there was nothing, and then there was queer. So anyway, so these young kids were coming who were in graduate school. I was going to people's 20th birthday parties. So it was quite nice for me, reliving my youth and learning, you know, to be activist with them. And it was quite serious. One night we were having our activist meeting in town, and terrorist bombs were going off around the corner and all this, and there was sirens everywhere. So we moved to my place, and then terrorist bombs going off over there. It was quite exciting. You felt like some things were happening. The other thing about India is that if you wanted to do something, like publish a magazine, or supposing you and I want to like do something, I don't write a book or I don't know, or whatever, something cultural, have a show. In India, it's impossible. It's a bit like the States that way. It's very private enterprise oriented.
So this was to do with funding?
Yeah, so whereas in England, if you want to do something, everybody would say, oh, that's all been done. You have to write an application to the Arts Council. It'll take 2 years before they decide to give you any money. Then they give you £1,000, by which time you're too tired and exhausted to do anything. We've done some funding applications, haven't we?
Yes.
You know what I mean with those funding applications.
We're tired.
So, but in India, we said, I looked around, there was no photography publication. There was nowhere to have a discourse. So there was no vehicle for it. So I found two lovely people, and I persuaded them, let's publish a magazine. And they said, okay, let's publish a magazine. So we had no money, no funding. And I said, yes, we used to have Camera Work magazine. We're going to use it as a model. So we called it Camera Work Delhi. And we got money from the French cultural people, attaché, to print it, the printing costs. We all did it for free. All our contributors did it for free. And we made a print magazine, despite everybody I spoke to in India said, why are you doing a print magazine? It should all be on the internet now. We're all on the internet. Who needs the print? I said, it's a print medium. It needs to be seen in print. And we're trying to spread the word about it, and spread the word that it's a medium worth reckoning. It needs to be seen on paper, so you can pick it up, take it home. So it was free, and we were just distributing it to our target audience, which was actually young people. India's got a very young demographic, as you probably know. A lot of them are still in college. So we do a lot of work with Indian students. I just did when I was there last week. I went to one of the leading women's colleges in Delhi University, who now have a queer group. I was quite startled, who said, come and speak. And they mustered 45 young women to come in here like this. So, you know, it's worked. Things, this word is sort of sunk in. And things are changing much more rapidly. So then I got the tabloid thing. Sorry, now we come to the tabloid.
Well, I think we're going to open up for questions from the audience. And I think I'll ask one more question while people think of things they would like to ask Sunil about his work and life. Maybe we could, I could just, as people are thinking of questions, I could ask you about, you said to me recently that when you were in India, in that point, when you moved there in 2005, you were testing the limits of what was possible in terms of what you could exhibit, what you could make work about, and you found those limits after a point.
No, I did. So every time somebody wanted me to contribute some visual material to a show or a project, I would take the gay thing like just that much further. And I kind of got away with it till Sun City, which had been done for a Pompidou Center exhibition, but I made it actually in a way I thought would be safe, like just about allowed in India. And in fact, the French showed it in their own gallery in the Alliance Française Center in Delhi. And somebody summoned the local cops who came and made a big scene and said, basically was saying it's against Hindu culture, which doesn't stand up in court, but it's very inflammatory. So it's no use arguing that that's not a legal reason, because they're busy taking all the pictures down. So that's much more, literally kind of more serious. So anyway, through an unfortunate combination of events, me and the pictures got caught in this little struggle between the Delhi police force and the French. The French guy who was running the Alliance Française. Personally, I suspect Indian cops typically just want some money, and the French guy didn't know how to do it. He was new, so he was trying to be all proper, and then they were threatening him with prison. I'm not sure if they said prison, but he'd just been to see Midnight Express, so he told me, I've been to see Midnight Express. I don't want to spend the night in an Indian prison. Please take your pictures away. So that's how it ended, kind of. But then it exploded into a big thing in the media. I put some samples up here because the Indian press and the local Indian art activists were very active also, decided to campaign around this. And so then, and they were chasing the police station, who eventually said, we didn't say anything. Its show can go on. Then it looked like the French had shut it down. And stuff like that was going back and forth. Meanwhile, the ball in the air was my work, which lawyers had said to me, against Hindu culture won't stand. What will stand is obscenity. They've got the same old obscenity laws that you have, which makes it criminal act is much more serious. Then you go to prison. And because I'm foreign, I don't go to prison. I get on a plane and I never come back. That's much more serious for me. But what it did do was have a huge impact on my little tiny fledgling support network of people who were helping and buying the odd print and stuff. I managed to make myself pretty overexposed in the Indian media because I was talking about, there was the whole gay rights was going through the courts that changed the law, and then HIV, and we were marching on the streets there, you know. But of course, like everywhere, the Indian collectors are very conservative. And so they just like everybody walking away from you.
Should we open up for questions at this point? I'm just conscious that we've got a very engaged audience, and it would be great to hear from them. Alan has a microphone, so if you just wait for the microphone before you ask your question.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. I guess I just wanted to kind of like continue the chronology and ask like, how do you feel your practice now is different from, say, when you first arrived in London? Because I imagine the activities, experience, and interest that you have now is also very different from when you first came here. Thank you.
Well, I like to think I'm a lot less naive now, because I kind of came back to London in 2012, started again. It was like, 2012 was like year zero once again. So what I've done is pick up what I learned from India. So first of all, I speak less to my peers. I don't speak to my age group. They're all bitter and twisted, even over here. So I've tried to meet a whole bunch of younger people who more recently graduated. So I do a bit of teaching here and there, a little bit. So through that, I met some, again, through the RCA and then the Slade and stuff. So art schools, basically. And some people like Fiona and Theo, who were art historians, but younger generation. And then just going out to shows and things where mostly it's young people. And we moved to Peckham. And so we're surrounded by a lot of people who are not, who seem to be doing things. And as Graham I see, running project spaces and things. So I find that very energizing and new and different. Compared to before, I mean, I don't feel like I have to constantly, I don't feel like I'm the only one. I don't feel like I have to struggle to explain. Everybody gets it, now. I think education has worked here as well, like in India. So I think when I go to a classroom, everybody kind of understands race and sex and gay and all that. So in fact, it's gone so extremely acceptable, dare I say, can I say it? So I've recently done a U-turn on that. So I'm thinking, I'm going back to being a gay man. I miss it. The queer thing's become too, like everybody's queer, it's like perfectly acceptable. And I'm not used to it. I'm more used to being more edgy and more criminal and you know, being very promiscuous in shady corners in Vauxhall. It's just, now I'm like all married up and yeah, and I'm doing all the things I never did. I got married, I've got a commercial gallery, you know, and they're talking edition prints and they drive me insane, always asking about, you know. And I can't do anything. I can't give you a picture. The gallery will not like it. So
yeah. Well, I think it was
change like
for us,
that.
it'll have anything to do with it. Clause 28 will be back in a renewed form. So.
No, that's true. So one thing to note, what I note is that it's taken the UK nearly 60 years to come from the first legislation to now, whereas other places are being expected to do this like practically overnight. So yeah. The other thing, of course, as you was pointing out, all of this is to do with laws, and so the next people can just reverse all this, and it'll all be changed, which is what happened in India. It became legal, then it became illegal, and it became legal again. So it goes back and forth. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks, Sunil. And thank you for your representation of brown bodies. I'm Shiraz, I'm half Gujarati. I work in words and pictures. And I thought I was going to ask you a question about your pictures, but actually I'm going to ask you a question about one word, black, and the black experience, and the way the word has changed. Could you explain a bit, if I was me in like 1972, would I describe myself as black? Has the word changed in that way? 1972, 82. I'm just saying, yeah, like decades ago. Has the word black changed from in the past? Was it a binary, like a white-black experience, and now we have?
No, it was a colonial, post-colonial thing. So it was basically, black was everybody who had ancestry that related to people who had been colonized by England, very specifically. So the first Colors of Black show that I remember at the GLC included the Irish. So he could have been in it because they're a colony of England. About being a colony of England in this country, that's what it was. So it wasn't skin color, literally. It was political. So, so our gay black group had a definition, which I have in a slide somewhere, probably not today, but we had a leaflet and it said what black was. Black was Indian, African, Chinese, Irish, that whole list of what black was. But it was in the post-colonial sense. So people were reading Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha. That was the text that was coming out, that it was coming out of. So it was postmodern aesthetically and post-colonial politically. That's the kind of world I emerged in 1983 into. Now I feel like it's becoming, with this BAME rubbish, it's become very literal, you know. It's gone back to being very literal, and people aren't sure what to call everybody else. Yeah. Do we call them BAME? Do we call them brown? Do we call them people of color? Nobody's sure. So I think, personally, I just want to be called Indian. Yeah. I'm gay and I'm Indian, it's very clear. I'm not South Asian. The South Asian thing is another thing. This is all coming from the US, by the way. We're incredibly hegemonic and like exporting all this. Mm-hmm. So South Asian is this catch thing for everybody from Afghanistan to Burma, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but actually mostly it's Indian. And it's just this sort of way of making us feel better. And, but I think we may as well be upfront then. And so yeah, I'm kind of retreating into a narrower, if you like, of just being an Indian gay man, how I started out, maybe.
There was another question over at the back over here.
Hi, Sunil.
Hi.
I'm Michael. I'm from the Tate. And actually, I just want to say how grateful I am that you're here, because you've lived so much, and your courage, your passion, your determination and tenacity is what has helped not just yourself, but all of us to be here. As far as representation, as far as visibility, but also, I love what you mentioned about that now you're much more involved with the younger people, because we need the legends like yourself to kind of, no, absolutely, and I'll say your legend, because I tell you, one of your piece in the 60 Years room at the Tate Britain, as soon as you enter, so the room is called 60 Years, and it's unfinished conversations based on Stuart Hall, the cultural theorist Stuart Hall. And one of the first images you see on the left is yours, Sunil Gupta. And so this whole understanding of interracial relationships, which I know back then, and you kind of touched on that also, on how now you feel like you're living your life, and you're now married up, as you said, you know what I mean? But the idea of kind of reliving your youth now at this age is, because I had two questions, but then you kind of, the gentleman asked the question and the other man asked the question regarding the whole black concept. And so I just want to say how grateful I am that you're here. I feel, look, I was busy with work, but I had to come here and see and say thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, going back to the questions that he mentioned regarding blackness, while I completely understand the whole concept of blackness was a continuation of the whole colonialism, I do think right now in the, particularly for gay men, and looking at the different ethnic groups there is a, there's less uniformity, less, you know, and integration in that regard. Even say, for example, with the Pride marches, there's National Pride and then there's Black Pride. And when you go to Black Pride, very seldom would you see any Asian person there, per se, unless they're in that sort of urban culture. And one of the things that I love so much about what you, as far as bringing that whole black concept, but really make it very clear, Black, Asian, and all of that in spite of it being a sort of colonial thing, you really made sure that there was a uniformity and encourage people of that part of that black, you know, that black narrative to come together. And I thought that was so, so important. And so you being here present today, full of life and humor and, you know, and being so personable, I think it's so, I believe that you have like another breath of life, another leaf in life to try to bring this community closer together. Because in this room today, I am the only black man. And honestly, I see the importance of you being here as a black man, but also as part of an ethnic minority. So it's really great that you are so much more involved. So my question to you, how do you think we should go about doing that, bringing these groups closer together? And in spite of, like you said, now, you said that you consider yourself, now you classify yourself now as Indian, but you also recognize that you're part of a minority. So how would you say bringing those groups together? And also, as far as pride marches, you know, it's less about, while there's always going to be a political statement, how can we bring much more integration, much more uniformity with all the different ethnic groups, all of us together? So using the pride marches and this whole, again, the blackness concept, okay? Did you understand my question?
I think so.
I said so because I just wanted to honor you also and give you your flowers.
Yeah, I think, well, so part of it is, I think that although we've apparently divided up a bit, and I think necessarily that may have to be the case because there is a distinctive Black Atlantic and a Pan-African identity and experience that needs addressing. And we don't want to keep wanting to dilute that. So let the Latinos and the Indians do their thing, I mean, which they are doing anyway. And they just need to, but I think what I don't want to do is to like constantly be on you saying, you know, like, hey, you know, you're not inviting me to the party. Because we have all these black shows and they are Afro. Let's just face it, that there have to be these temporarily, whatever, at this moment in time. That's what's needed with Black Lives Matter, you know, like, and that really does matter. And the background is also that, of course, we're partly also here because back in the 80s, half of my fellow countrymen thought they were white and not black. I spent half my time trying to convince other Indians that you're black. They said, no, I'm not. I said, but you are. But they said, no. And they would, they didn't like me identifying and promoting blackness, you know, because they spent their whole lives and generations of this caste business trying to be, you know, something whiter in a sense. So, so yeah, it's always been, I describe it with an ease and a kind of humor because I think I recognize now that I lived in a bubble. You know, in the 80s I thought, oh, everybody gay must be left-wing and, you know, and live in South London and have a boyfriend of a different race. That was obviously the thing to do. And then suddenly there are, you know, there are gays who are Tories. There are black people who are Tories, for fuck's sake. There are Indians who are like worse than the white people, right? So, and so obviously color alone doesn't do it. So we do need to make this coalition around politics rather than singular identities. And I think that's what was the strength in London in the 80s that I miss, that, for example, the Americans didn't have. America's all about apartheid. The blacks do their thing and the Chinese do their thing, and it's very divided that way. But we had kind of united front going for a while. And that did feel very strong, you know, that as you're saying, we're a diverse group here. We can do anything together. We're a threat to all those right-wing people who want to have pure countries, pure races, you know, and all of that, to the Russians, to the Chinese, to everyone.
Maybe that's a good point to end, because that's, we've been talking for an hour, and that was a very powerful question and point of reflection to end on. And there are soft drinks and wine, and we can stay here for a bit longer and have some informal conversation. But thank you so much, Sunil, for sharing.
Thank you.